Hello everyone, welcome to this series of discussions about the life and works of Roger Scruton, British political philosopher of conservative intellectual interests. My name is Ferenc Hörcher. I'm a political philosopher at the University of Public Service here in Budapest. And the series is about the books of Roger Scruton. And this time, my partner in this discussion, my guest for this event is Francesco Giubilei, with whom we are going to talk about conversations with Roger Scruton. Now, Francesco is an old friend and an intellectual in Italy, president of Fondazione Tattarella and Nazione Futura, and also a fellow of MCC Budapest. So welcome. Hello, Francesco.
Hello, thank you very much for your invitation and congratulations for this great idea. I think it's very important to talk about Roger Scruton, and I think it's very important to talk about conservatism. So it's a pleasure to be here today.
We appreciate it. And the topic today is, as I said, Conversations with Roger Scruton by Roger Scruton and Mark Dooley. And this is a book which has got discussions. So we have got discussions and we discuss them. And the usual order is that we have got two quotations from each of us, and we share the time among them. And we decided that I could start offering my quotation, my first one. So if you don't mind, let's go. This is the quote. All my political thinking grows in the end from a love for English law, for the Inns of Court, and for what the Inns have represented in our culture. End of quote. This is, I think, an interesting topic because it connects politics and law in a very, serious and direct way. Why? Because, of course, Scruton is a philosopher, educated in Cambridge, so he has got an analytical British-style philosophical background. But he also was educated at one of the Inns of Court in London for becoming a lawyer. And he just did not have the time for the apprenticeship afterwards to make the exams, but basically he has got the legal education that is necessary for a lawyer in Britain. So he has got these two aspects, the philosopher's one and the lawyer's one. And I think that that's important for a conservative to have those two aspects. Why? First of all, in Britain or in England even more. Why? Because Britain has this idea of the rule of law, perhaps the longest history in modern Europe. Connecting law and politics. And that's, I think, a very special conservative idea that you rely on the traditional customs of your country and you try to elaborate it and make it adaptable to the modern circumstances and to establish a rule of law, a constitutional democracy based on those ancient, hundreds of years old traditions. How do you see this from an Italian perspective?
I think that is a very interesting point, and you give me like an assist because you talk about an Italian perspective. Everyone knows that Roger Scruton is an English writer, that is an English conservative thinker, but is also a European conservative thinker in a certain way. And I think it's very important to underline that Europe is, before becoming a political concept, is a cultural concept. And so we share a lot of common vision together as a European people. And especially I want to underline, and starting with my quote, and it's a quote about Italy and about the link between Roger Scruton and Italy. And he say, when I was in Rome, we are in more or less 1966, when I was in Rome, I was again living hand to mouth, renting a room from a girl who rented a house in the Piazza del Biscione, just off the Campo dei Fiori. So we are in the city center of Rome. Her name was Elena Einaudi, and her father was a big cheese publisher who was the familiar combination of Marxist and millionaire. She had fled from him and repudiated her parents, but remained in contact with her grandmother, widow of the Italy's first post-war president. I'll explain everything, but I want to conclude my quotation. Elena identified herself as a bohemian, and so the contact with Helena Bohemian hippie circle in Rome did make me realize that wherever I am not that. It's very interesting, in my opinion, this quotation. First of all, because of Elena Einaudi. Elena Einaudi was the daughter of Giulio Einaudi. Giulio Einaudi is one of the biggest publishers in Italy, and Einaudi followed a lot the doctrine of Gramsci, so the concept of the cultural hegemony. And it's very important, I think, also in Roger Scruton life, the concept of cultural hegemony, when, for example, he teaches in university, and in this book, he explained when he teaches for 20 years, if I don't remember wrong, he teaches in a London university, and he understands how university is full of liberal and leftist thinkers and concepts. But in the same time, it's very interesting because the granddad of Elena was Luigi Einaudi, our first president of the Republic. And Luigi Einaudi was a very strong classical liberal president. So it's interesting that her grandchildren was a leftist person instead of Einaudi was a very classical liberal president. And the other interesting point of this quote, I think, is that Scruton understands for the first time in his life that he's not a liberal, that he was not like a leftist thinker, but he is understands that he was a conservative person. He becoming to understand that he was a conservative thinker. And after 2 years, in 1968, how everyone knows, will be the revolution in France. And in this time, Scruton will be, he was in France in 1968. So I think that it's very interesting that a person like Scruton, an English writer, an English thinker, become conservative, first of all in Italy and after in France. That is very important to underline how there is a link in the European cultural world. And in the same times, I think it is very important to understand how the cultural concept of Italy, but also of France, but I mean in all the Western European context in 1966, in 1968, and after in the 70s, in the 80s, was very linked, unfortunately, with the leftist thinker.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, we are talking about the cultural connections between Britain as an island and the other parts of Europe, although Italy is a peninsula, so in a way it's also a little bit different than all the others. And as you mentioned, he went there to stay after his first degree in Cambridge, to get inspiration in Italy and France, the traditional grand tour, as we could explain it. And coming from Britain, which comparatively speaking was of course always a classical liberal or conservative framework, although after the Second World War there too the labor could get through. But all together, compared to the other parts of Europe, it was still a conservative climate. And then he comes to Italy, and he is, as you explained in this lively manner, he was in the center of a political and cultural elite. He thought that, well, that's his place, and then he had to realize that was not the case. So that's very interesting. And as far as the legal background of the two countries are concerned, of course, Italy was always anxious about its ancient traditions, the Roman, ancient Roman background, and the rule of and the tradition of Roman law as received and the reception process getting through the centuries of medieval and early modern Italian culture. But of course, we are after the Second World War, when Italy became fascist, and we are in the 60s, when Italy became a left-wing country. So radical, Poles, very radical right-wing swing, and then a radical left-wing swing. And perhaps that helps Scruton to identify himself as a conservative as opposed to those radicalisms. Do you agree?
I agree with you, and I think in the conservative world there are two years that are very important here for what is the conservatism. The first year is of course the 1789, so the French Revolution. How we know Edmund Burke wrote the reflection on French Revolution in the 1790, so the year later the French Revolution, and this was the first turning point and probably the start of a new vision of conservatism, especially in the Anglo-Saxon context. And the second year that is very important for all the world, but especially for conservatism, is the 1968. Because I think that the 1968, especially in Western Europe, represent like a turning point. I mean, here in Central and in Eastern Europe, you had different situations. You had a communist regime, and it's quite impressive that, for example, in Czech Republic, what is now Czech Republic, of course, but in Czech in 1968, they were fighting for their freedom. They were fighting against the communist regime. And in the meantime, in France, in Italy, in United Kingdom, in United States, there was the new revolution, but it's a different kind of revolution. It's a revolution where they want to discover, they talk about freedom, but in a different way, because they are still freedom. They live in a democracy. And I think that Italy, in this moment, lived a very switch from what was a very Catholic country. So in our country, also today, but unfortunately we lost part of our Catholic roots, but we are still a very Catholic country. But in the time, the Catholic Church was very strong. And also in the political context, for example, the political party who was leader of Italy after fascism until the 1992 was the so-called Democrazia Cristiana. And it was a party very linked with the Catholic Church. But in the same time, what happened after 1968, that starting in the cultural, in the media, in the university, in the school, starting a new hegemony by the left. And for example, for the conservative Italian world, it's very important what happened in 1974, when was founded the new newspaper Il Giornale, that is one of the most conservative newspaper also now. And it was made by Montanelli, that was a very important Italian journalist, and he worked before for Il Corriere della Sera, that it was the main Italian newspaper. And this newspaper that started as a classical liberal newspaper, after 1968 became a leftist newspaper. So Italy was living in this moment a very switch of the society, and it's very, I think, incredible that Roger Scruton was in this period in Italy, and he lived in the house of an Audi, so he can see by himself what is changing the society. And we know as a conservative that not every time that society changes is the good things, because there are some roots that we have to conserve, and probably that was Roger Scruton understanding Rome and after in Paris.
Yes, of course, Rome means a lot of things beside politics and the center of the centralized Italy. But for centuries, Italy was just a very rich territory of independent city-states, so to say. And of course, when in Rome, you are interested in the cultural heritage of that period. And Roger, as a person interested in the history of architecture as well as art history, went there to study Baroque art, Borromini and Bernini and all those great names of Baroque art. And what he discovered was that for him the tradition is even more important than Baroque art. But basically, the contrast between present-day politics and the classical tradition with its harmony and order as contrasted with this world of anarchistic, Euro-socialist, whatever, communist ideas, was a real contrast. And this duality of his way of thinking, of having a cultural package which had a very wide vista and a very rich content of very different European authors and thinkers and painters, sculptors, architects, and the present day of political reality, which was quite disenchanting and almost like fearful, as when in Paris he actually was witnessing the destruction of shop windows and all those events that followed the student revolution. So I think that this duality in his thinking is quite important.
Yeah, of course, it's very important, and I think that Rome is the city where you can find a lot of different situations, because it's not only the capital of Italy, but it's also the capital of the the Catholic Church. So in one way, you can find what is the Christian heritage with all the Christian buildings, and so also with Baroque buildings and church. But in the same times, it was the capital of probably the greatest empire in the world. So you can find also the classical heritage, but in the same time now it's the capital of one of the biggest countries of Europe. So you can find also what is the Italian identity. So it's like I want to say a melting pot, but not in a multicultural way. We know that Scruton wrote a lot of important books and a lot of important articles about the concept of multiculturalism in the wrong definition of the concept of the multiculturalism. But Rome is quite different, because Rome is the capital, or was the capital, of two big empires who think about the concept of universalism. So the difference between multiculturalism and universalism is that the Roman Empire, when want to conquer, for example, other land, they export the concept of mos maiorum. So they export the concept of their identity, of the Roman identity, all over. And the same is with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is a universal church. It's not a multicultural church. It's quite different. So in Rome you can find different identities, but I think that the most important identity is the classical and the Christian heritage that are shared together. And probably when Scruton was there, he liked the city, and he understands how the classical roots are more important of what happened and later, and also the concept of, for example, the Rinascimento. Rinascimento is linked to the rediscovery of the classical world. And in other great book of Roger Scruton, when you talk about, for example, architecture, it's very classical in a certain way, and he understands how it's important to, for example, not only rediscover but conserve, which are our roots, also linked with the architecture and also linked with the buildings.
Yes, and with that, I think we can move over to our second pair of quotations. From me, this one is about his relationship to Christianity, and also in a way to Catholicism. He went from Rome to France and lived there, and in fact his first wife was French and had a French culture. So in a sense that was very important for him, and also the role of Catholicism was important in the first marriage of him. But later he returned to Anglicanism. Yet, as a philosopher, he had his doubts, and that's what comes out from this quote that I brought for us to discuss. What appeals to me in Christianity is the way in which the central mystery of God incarnate in a human person connects him to the supreme act of sacrifice. I think that this undergoing of death on our behalf is a profound thing. To know that we share this with God himself is what reconciles us to death. But I'm skeptical about the resurrection and the afterlife. So I think that there is this duality again in him, so contradictions and paradoxes. He is able to identify himself with the embodiment, the incarnation of God in the human person, with Christ. Why? Because he sees the life of Christ as a life of sacrifice. Christ sacrificed himself for us. On the other hand, and therefore he finds the human side of him, and therefore he is able to feel together with that sacrifice. And it helps him to die. We know how Roger himself dies, so in a way we can connect this idea to his own very smooth approach of this final stage. And then there is a skepticism in him as well. As a philosopher, there is nothing to worry about that. Philosophy is questioning things. But he remains skeptical about the resurrection and the afterlife, which is important for Christianity and for Catholicism. So in a way, he remains skeptical. He can go to a certain extent, but not any further. He stops at a certain point, and he does not know. He is not a disbeliever or an atheist. He is an agonist, I would say, so and an agnostic, and that means that he does not find a solution in this worldly life for an afterlife, and he does not believe in resurrection and the afterlife, but believes in the incarnate God. So that's a very interesting
That's
position.
very interesting. I think that Scruton in all his life has like a struggle with religion. He every time talk about Catholicism, but he never converted, he was never a Catholic. In the same time, sometimes he was disappointed with the Anglican Church, but he's definitely linked with Christian roots, and he's tried for all his life to study what is Christianism and understand some different and difficult point of our religion. But it's very interesting what you said, because I think, and then coming to my second quotation, I think that Scruton in all his life talk about the concept of the environment. He explained from a conservative perspective how it's important to build a green conservatism. And especially when he talk about green conservatism, he underlined how there is a vision of the environment from a conservative perspective that is linked with the Christian vision. So when we talk about the Christian vision of the environment, we talk about the concept of the creation. In the Bible, in the Genesis, there is a part where the Bible talks about the creation. And the creation is a link between the nature and the man. So, nature and man are part of one thing that is the concept of the creator. So, the man is not an enemy of the nature, how, for example, the new leftist or globalist environment say. No, the man and the nature are part of one single thing that is the creator. And so in 1211, Scruton published Green Philosophy, How to Think Seriously About the Planet. I thought to show how the environment is best protected, not by global activism, but by local initiatives that inspire and are inspired by a love of home. It was a comprehensive defense of conservatism and the philosophy best placed to care for creation. However, I put it to Scruton, now it's too late that he is talking, that it seemed to have been overloaded by the left. Some do take an interest in it, but generally it's true that the book is not much referred to by left-leaning Greens. So, in this part is very interesting because Scruton underlined how it's possible to have a different vision of the environment from a conservative perspective. We talk about the Christian vision, but we can also underline the importance of the community. So we have to underline, and how the concept of the community is very important in the conservative world. Also, Edmund Burke explained how the community is the central topic, but also Ferdinand Tönnies, a lot of writers talk about the concept of the community, and he said that an environment vision of the world from a conservative perspective has to start from the local. not from the global. And it's very important difference. He underlined how it's important to live in a countryside, for example. In fact, Scrutopia, where Scruton lived the last years of his life, was like a farmhouse. So he lived in direct contact with the nature. And this is very important, not only from a cultural perspective, but I think also from a political perspective, especially now that we are talking every day about the concept of the environment. And sometimes some people say that a conservative, that a right-wing person cannot be linked with the environment, but this is not true. And I think that Scruton is the best example to explain how can exist a different vision of the environment.
Yes, I fully agree with your passion about that, because I think that the left was taking it over from the general discussion and privatized nature and the environment. And I think that the concepts that he provides, Scruton, are philosophically sound and basic, and they explain much more actually than the green philosophers, often sentimentalist or scientist concepts. I would refer to two of them, which I have found very fruitful. One of it is oikophilia, of course, the love of the place. He explains that our belonging to our community is not ethnocentric. It's not the race that matters or the nation. What really matters is our connection with the place where we live, actually. And he refers with that, of course, to Aristotle as well, but he also connects it to that sort of community, the local community, which in Italy and in many other European countries were, connected to the church and to the small community around the church who shared the same belief. So and share the same way of life and share the same political faith. So in that sense, oikophilia, I think, is crucial to understand that we can only defend our natural environment and also our built environment if we belong to it and we accept it as our part of our faith. Yeah. And the second concept is, again, connecting it back to religion. It's pietas, the concept of piety, that there is a need to be, self-disciplined. Humanity is a bit proud of its achievements and a bit too proud of it, and that means that they tend to forget about the duties, the responsibilities for the next generation, as Burke explained, the generations of the dead and the not yet born are just as important as the present generation. And so in this sense, there is a need for pietas, a need for self-reserve and also honoring those powers which are beyond us, which we do not know much about, and which includes in our faith God as well.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I want to underline, you talk about the concept of oikophilia, and Scruton explained also what is the opposite of oikophilia, that is oikophobia. So it's the hate for your house, for your country, for your nation, for your culture, your tradition. And when he talks about oikophobia, he explains what is happening, unfortunately, more in Western Europe, I think, that here in Central and Eastern Europe, because you, in a certain way, you are rediscovered after communism, after a lot of years of dictatorship, you understand how it's important to fight for freedom. You understand how it's important, for example, rediscover your Christian roots. You understand how it's important to fight for the family and other things. But what is happening now in Western Europe, and Scruton explains this kind of thing in a lot of pages of his book, is that we are living like an oikophobia, so we want to delete what is our culture, with the political correctness, but also with the so-called cancel culture, where some people want to destroy and want to read the history with the eye of a contemporary people, but we can't read what happened 2,000 years ago, what happened in the Roman age, what happened in the medieval age with the eye of a contemporary person. And that is a very important issue. And I think that also probably why in the last year of his life, Scruton was linked with Hungary, he was linked with the Central Europe, but there is a strong link, and also in this book he explained when during the communist era he came in the Eastern Europe to try to help some dissident. And it's very important also the concept of freedom. In whole the book of Roger Scruton, I think the concept of freedom is very central to his reflection, and also in the conversation with Giubilei, he understands and he explained how is important the concept of freedom, and in the same time it's a bit sad to see that also one probably of the biggest, or probably the biggest conservative thinker of the contemporary era was not protected by the conservative political world. You remember what happened with the scandal because of the interview in a New Statement?
In his last year of his life,
yeah.
and the Conservative Party, yeah, which was on government, withdrew, yeah, him from the committee, from the presidency of the committee.
I think this is a very, very important lecture, especially for the Western European Conservative political party, that sometimes are not linked with the intellectual world. And I think it's very important to build strong relation with the intellectual world and the political world. And in a certain way, that's what the left doing better than us. Mm-hmm. In the sense that when happened like a scandal or someone attack a leftist intellectual in our country, but also in United Kingdom, in France, there is a political world who defend these people.
But I think even more important in this respect is the communication between us intellectuals and the cultural world, because I think that civil society needs to get stronger, yeah, in the sense that he describes which is that the cultural, the participants of the cultural world, the academia, should know about each other and accept each other even if they are different. So in that sense, even the leftist colleagues should have been defending him. I think that would have been a nice gesture, because they have got the majority now in the academia. But that happened, and I think that's a symbolic event, and it's also symbolic that the Central European countries decorated him in his last years, and I think that we tried our best to keep his memory alive. So thank you, Francesco, for coming and discussing this book, which is going to be published in Hungary in the summer, and as you mentioned, in Italy in the autumn by your publishing house. And thank you for the interest of the audience, and let's read Scruton.